can't wait to read the rest of the story. It just, wow. So next we have Samuel Snoek-Brown, who's here to read for us tonight. He writes and teaches in Portland, Oregon. He also works as production editor for Jersey Devil Press and lives online at snookbrown.com. His work has appeared in Bartleby Snopes, Ampersand Review, Fiction Circus, Uonia Review, Red Fez, SOL, English Writing in Mexico, and others. He's the author of the flash fiction chapbook Box Cutters, which is available here tonight, thanks to Sam, and the novel Hagridden, which is just out, right?
As of yesterday.
As of yesterday. How exciting. You are lucky folks. For which he received the 2013 Oregon Literary Fellowship. And I think, he's going to read some for us. So come on, Sam.
Thank you all so much for being here. And thank you, Malvern Books, for hosting us. This is such a great event. Thank you to my friend Wendy Walker of the Austin Review here in town for helping set this up as well. I'm going to have to do this really corny thing. My wife couldn't be here with me on the trip, so I've been taking selfies of the crowd here. So everybody gets to wave and say hi as I take a picture of everyone. All right. Thank you all so much. So I'm going to read a little bit from the novel Hagridden, which is set during the Civil War, but it's actually set out in the Louisiana Bayou. Way down in a part of the country where the war didn't really touch all that much. It's actually the place where people went to get away from the war. They would go crawling into the bayou if they had deserted the army or were running away from conscriptionists, because the bayou itself was such a harsh and unforgiving place that once you were in there, nobody wanted to go in and find you. The problem was it was also such a harsh and forgiving place, it was really, really hard to make a living down there. So the story's about these two women who are managing to eke out their existence by killing anyone who strays into the marsh and then selling their gear through the black market in exchange for food or sundries. So what I thought I'd do, I'm going to pick up in chapter 2. They've already killed a couple of guys and they're meeting with this corrupt, decrepit old black market man named Clovis in his shop out in the swamp. So I'm going to read a little bit from that. When day rose in a fog over the marsh, they were awake already, resetting their crawfish traps and bringing in the wash they'd abandoned the day before. The air had stilled in the night, and they could hear a few quiet birds uncertain in their songs. A handful of California gulls drifted inland from the beaches south, once the warble of a masked booby. Little else. The women sat just outside their doorway and nibbled on dry biscuits, sometimes picking out the mealworms. When they'd eaten, they pulled out their goods and arranged them in the patch of earth before the hut, sorted and packed them carefully into a haversack and old rucksack. They kept nothing for themselves, the soldiers' own supply lines long bereft of anything the women didn't already have. In the load they now prepared, they had 3 rifles, one a repeater, though broken in some way they couldn't decipher, as well as a spare smoothbore musket, and each woman strapped on the shoulder arms to make a wide X across her bosom. Then each hefted a pack onto her back. They took up their own arms, now clean save the stain of blood that would never leave the sharpened pole, and they hiked slowly into the marsh, feeling their path on instinct through the marsh toward the deeper bayou beyond. The bayou was rimmed in occasional cypress hung heavy with a curtain of moss. The sun filtered through the ochre and dark green, and the muddy shallows trapped among the roots wavered sickly in the light. All manner of putrid life slewed unseen in the muck. The women skirted the rim and walked along the spotty tree line until they came to a slender bar of moss-carpeted clay, humped out of the bayou and tapering into the brackish interior. They held their weapons perpendicular like circus artists on a tightrope and walked swiftly along the narrow ridge of earth until they came to a shallow lake, a lonesome cypress rising from the water at the edge. a tribe of woody knees surrounding the trunk like a congregation. These they navigated into the lake to a tiny island knotted with the roots of an oak tree. And so they progressed across the shallow lake. The air was damp and heavy, and their hair hung flat in their eyes, but they did not need to see, so often had they come this way in the last 3 years. They took their time and trusted their feet, and at length they found a rotting wooden plank that led from a knee of root to a shabby boardwalk. They alit on the walk and followed its zigzagging path to the shack they sought. They rested against the shambles of the dark wood shack, and the old woman beat at the door with the side of her fist. "Clovis, you in there?" She pounded again. "Come on, where you at?" They heard a groan from the shack that could have been a man, but might as easily been the shack itself. But the groan was succeeded by a rolling belch, and the old woman shook her head and pushed on through the door. Clovis sat in a cane chair leaned against a side wall. His shirt was loose and open over his hollow chest, and he'd cut the legs of his underwear at the knees to let his skinny calves breathe. He was picking his teeth with a slender dagger as they entered, but when the thin light fell in a loose rectangle over him, he looked up and smiled, raised the small bowl from which he drank his whiskey. Behind him, arrayed in what to him must have made sense, stood counters and shelves stacked with various accoutrements. A rack of firearms on the back wall beside them, and beside them a lumped pile of feed bags and flour sacks from which flour sifted through holes in the seams to form tiny white cones on the damp wood floor. A shelf with twice-read newspapers reshuffled and folded new. Beside them, mildewed books, a small case of straight razors, and on a counter near the shelf, a motley display of tin cups, hammered tin plates, and oxidizing cutlery. A cluster of barrels in the corner draped in a wide canvas cloth but reeking of home-distilled whiskey. A decrepit black gimp slouched against the barrels with his eyes rolling aimlessly in his head, his huge head wallowing against the canvas and his mouth open for no apparent reason. Clovis eyed the women and took a long, sloppy drink from his bowl, then set it aside and leered at them. "Got me something good?" he said, and without further word, the women set their loads on the floor and unstrapped the firearms and opened the sacks. He gored muck from under his fingernails with the tip of the dagger as he watched them. When they'd finished, they stepped away and waited. He tipped forward his chair and hauled the bags closer. He hefted one of the rifles and cocked it, then let down the hammer and nodded, but when he picked up the smoothbore, he grunted and tossed both shoulder arms in the corner. He bent to root through the packs, but only tilted a few items to peer beneath them. He flipped shut the flap on the rucksack and kicked the haversack with his bare toes. "This is shit," he said. "This the best you could get for old Clovis?" "This is all they is, and you know it," the old woman said. "It's as good as we ever got," the girl said, but the old woman put a hand on her arm. "All you ever got was shit. Hell, petites, I couldn't use none of this. It'd be a hassle just to keep it in my store." Clovis stood up, tottering over them. "People's gonna need this stuff," the woman said. Clovis stretched his arms akimbo with his fist on his bony hips as though to steady himself on himself. He eyed them both and shook his head. "New Orleans was taken 2 years ago. Some say General Lovell done run off crying. Them Yankees took Fort DeRussy too. They running now, I hear. Had us a good win up in Mansfield, but the Yankees turned it right around in Natchitoches, and they's beating us still, even while retreating. It don't make no difference either way anymore. They pulled Grant out of these parts and sent him to Virginia. War's in the East. We done down in these parts, far as I's concerned. Won't be but just skirmishes now." He spat into the corner and bent to collect his bowl. "I got no more customers to sell this shit to." He tipped his bowl and drank. "This shit, you call it, come to you all but free anyway, Clovis. You'll turn $1 on it somehow, no matter where's the war's at. Come on, vieux, make a bill." Clovis scratched his chin, then drained his bowl and slung it into the back of the shop. He kicked at the gimp by the barrels. "Hey, boy," I apologize for my language here, but, "Hey, boy, get your nigger ass up and clear this junk." The gimp rolled his eyes over the 2-pack, then tottered toward them and dragged them by their straps around to a counter. Clovis sauntered toward the shelf near his chair and pulled up a floorboard and withdrew a plain box. He lifted the lid and started rifling through crumpled bills. "My eye," the woman said. "You ain't handing us no money and you know it. We want food, you old bastard." He chuckled and tossed the box onto the chair, a few bills of paper fluttering forgotten on the floor. Okay, he said. He went to the back by the stacks of rifles and rummaged in the pile of feed sacks. He brought a heavy bag of rice and sack of flour, and he chucked the food at their feet. "Eat you one," he said. "This here's good stuff. Get you a rube going, you be set for anything." "Got any coffee?" the girl said. Clovis laughed loud to shake the roof beams and clapped his chest. "Shit, child, when you see coffee last? Go talk to the Yankees. I got me some yapon leaves you're welcome to if you want to brew you some tea." "Shit," the woman said. "Keep it. We'll just keep on brewing acorns." The two women hefted their sacks and turned to shuffle out into the bayou. Clovis sat in his chair and leaned it against the wall again, but he called out to them as they crossed his threshold. "Now stay yourself there, boo. You want you a little more? Maybe some of this old bust head?" He hefted a jug and decanted into his bowl, then held it out on offer. "Come on in here, to both of you, and stay a while. Stay the night, maybe." He winked at them and licked his lips. "The hell you say," the old woman said. "I never with the old drunken bastard likes of you." He laughed and leaned back on the wall and slurped from his bowl as they turned again into the bayou. So after they've sold their goods, they're back at home, they're making themselves some dinner, and into the bayou comes an old neighbor of theirs, a man named Buford. He and the old woman's son, the young girl's husband, had gone off to war together. They were best friends. Buford comes back and lets them know that Remy, the girl's husband, has died in the war. And now it's just Buford, who's deserted the army and is hiding out in the bayou. He goes back to his old shack to see what's there, but it's kind of fallen apart. And now he's thinking about maybe making a play for the girl since her husband is dead. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and get to a point where he spent the first night back in his old shack and is going back to check on the girl. Buford's shack had fallen off. Oh no, he's going to spend the first night there and then he goes. Okay. Buford's shack had fallen off its thick cypress blocks and listed rhomboid in the reeds, one wall sagging into the water. In the night, it looked like some hulking fabrication of the marsh slinking back into the muck whence it had come. He approached the good side with his knife in his fist, crouching below the window, then craning his neck to peer over the sill. He held his breath. He half expected to find the crazed lieutenant hunkered inside. He's being stalked and hunted by this lieutenant who doesn't like that he deserted the army. Hunkered inside, panting like a dog, Buford a bone he longed to dig up. Or worse, there were stories he never believed but would consider now. The blazing eyes of a rougarou, it's a bayou werewolf, a rougarou leering yellow through the painless frame. The werewolf of the bayou, the hot breath through its dripping teeth, the breath of the swamp itself. He saw nothing inside, but smelled it nonetheless, a rot of flesh and fur, though it was a stench of ordinary decay, nothing supernatural about it. He slid down an embankment into water up his ankles and wrenched askew the broken door. He crouched and waited. He heard a scuttle and whine, then felt the matted fur of a small dog scuff past his foot, but he kept immobile. When nothing else moved, he reached the match safe from his pocket and popped aflame a match on the door frame. The interior of the shack wavered in the yellow light like it was underwater. A wreck of moldering reeds in one corner, the scent of scat by the wall that canted into the marsh. His lantern, bent and glassless, still hung on a nail by the door, but it was drained and wickless. Some shards of crockery. Nothing else remained. His few utensils, his table and 2 chairs, and his bed frame, his old cook stove, everything pillaged. The match expired on his thumb tip and he hissed. He shuffled into the corner where he'd seen the pile of reeds, kicked at it, and heard a scuttle of insects. When his eyes had readjusted to the dark, he stirred the nest with his walking stick till he was satisfied whatever had called it home had now absconded. Then he kicked the reeds together again and fell atop the loose mat to sleep. But no sleep arrived, and he lay instead for some hours, just staring upward into nothing. Sometime near midnight, he woke screaming to flashes in the dark and covered his head and scurried into a corner. But when the concussion came, it was only the rumble of thunder. He rolled upright and leaned against the wall, hugging himself with his knees against his chest. When the lightning flashed, it showed like teeth through the gaps in the roof planks, and he flinched each time the thunder followed, but after several minutes he caught his breath and stilled. A hollow pat tapped an uneven rhythm on the slanted rooftop, and soon the rain was drumming away. He began to cry quietly. The floor went damp in strips. The rain went on for 2 days straight. Each house, Buford's shack and the low marsh hut where the women lived, lay quiet in the rain, where their inhabitants attended to what chores they could. Buford spread his cassock on the roof and covered it in reeds to slow the seepage indoors. And naked he worked on the house, prying loose the tilted side in the water one board at a time, hauling out barehanded what nails he could. He tore down the whole side, left just the one central stud to hold up the roof while he worked. Then, with the base of the decrepit lantern for a mallet, he hammered up a makeshift wall. Hoped it would hold through the weather until he could dismantle the whole mess and start clean on higher ground. At their hut, the women went out each wet morning and each steamy evening to muck the marsh for risen crawfish and anything else that might escape in the fallacious safety of the storm. Each wondered if the other was crying, but it was hard to tell in the rain, and neither spoke of the deceased Remy, or indeed of much else. Indoors they boiled roots and crawfish and water bugs and sipped the hot stew, dared not open their sacks of grain as the water dripped through the gaps in the reed roof, and they tried not to look at each other, each lost in her thoughts. On the second afternoon, the old woman stepped out back to the rain barrel and shut the door and stayed there a long time. When she came in, the girl noticed dirt under the woman's ragged nails, but she said nothing of it, and soon the old woman had sprawled like a dead crab on the mattress and was breathing in an abnormal rhythm, though she did not sleep. Neither slept much, and always they listened for drifters or nearby skirmishes, but none arrived. The morning, hot already in the early summer, the girl sat out on a shallow plank by the water, scrubbing laundry in a bucket. The wind had left with the storm, and the air hung heavy as her hair, limp in her eyes, and she kept sweeping it back to sea. After one such swipe, she spied Buford, shirtless, wading up through the shallows, his shadow stretched long before him. He carried a cane pole and a string of 2 small fish. When he reached her, he slung the pole over his shoulder and draped the fish on it as he cocked a foot up onto the plank. He tied the cassock into pantaloons around his legs, and they draped heavy from his bare knees, dripping on the plank. His shadow covered her and slipped out into the water. He said nothing, just watched her rub and wring her laundry, but she paid him no attention. Finally, he spat into the marsh and stood tall again. Fine summer day out in the bayou. Even the skeeters is resting. He gazed at her openly as she rocked to and fro with the wash. A body could near forget days of war on. The girl didn't look at him, but she spoke. Them some nice little fish you got there. They good for eating? They just a couple of bullhead. Good enough for one as ain't got none. What about y'all? What y'all's doing for food these days? He looked around him as though to find some hidden store in the reeds. You ain't farming. I've been all around these parts these last few days and ain't seen no plots. Nothing'll grow out here and you know it, she said. Buford nodded and licked his thick lips. Uh-huh. You know, when I was in camp, there was this sutler. This fella sold all sorts of things. Stuff you wasn't supposed to be able to get no more, at least not in camp. He brought in coffee, by God, coffee, and some old pop skull, and one time he had this picture of a naked lady. Not some drawing, but one of them photographs, and her all splayed on a bed, undressed, and her legs spread. I don't need to offend, but that's the world we's in now. This old boy got himself rich, I'm telling you. He leaned against the plank again, one foot up and his free arm on his knee. You know how he done it? He was stealing. Everybody out there is stealing. That's the only way to survive anymore, even in the army. I stole from that sutler what he done stole to sell us and save in wartime. He dipped his head to catch her eye. She glanced at him but kept on at the washing. That's what y'all been up to, ain't it? Stealing some? She ignored him. Come on now, tell me where y'all is getting it, and maybe I can help some. Like you helped my husband? The girl dropped her rags and looked at him directly. Buford stood back and scratched his head. Why'd you leave Remy there in that house to die? I didn't leave him to die. He was already dead. I just left him, same as you would have. She resumed her wash with greater fervor, wrestling the cloth more than cleaning it. You pining for him? That it? You shut up about him, she said. You must have been thinking about it lately. Since I come back? What you gonna do now he's dead? You can't stay here with that old woman. You young and healthy and have your own self to think about. Your own needs. You mind your mouth, you hear? He ran his tongue over his heavy lower lip and smiled at her. You could mind it for me. How's about you come on over to my place? I got room for you. They heard a rustle in the reeds, and he looked up as the girl resumed her wash. The old woman approached with a fresh basket, and he watched her come. The early morning light through the heads of the reeds cut ochre strips across her face so it flickered as she walked. He waved at her when she was near. Say, I was just telling how fine a day it is out. Not too hot yet. Buford, what the hell are you doing over here and down in the water? You want to visit, you come on up to the house like normal folk. He hefted the rod at her, the catfish dangling loose on either side of the pole. Why, I was catching some fish. Man's got to eat, you know. He smiled at her and gestured with the pole. I suppose woman's got to eat too. She sneered at him, but he laughed and flicked the pole so the fish tumbled onto the plank. Y'all take these. Repay you for your kindness the other night. What about you, the girl said. I'll go catch me some more. He turned and waded back up the water, his knees coming up high to clear the weeds and muck below. The girl looked from the fish back at the woman. Go on and take it, the woman said. Ain't polite nor smart to turn down good food when it's offered. Then she herself grabbed up the fish. These look all right. Bit small, but good enough for us. She turned them glistening in the heavy light and then looked down at the girl. What was y'all talking about? Nothing, she said. Just the weather, like you said. How hot it's going to get later. You stay clear of that son of a bitch. He ain't even sorry he come back alone. For all we know, he killed our Remy himself. If Remy even dead, ain't no better than a Yankee. She spat in near the same spot as Buford had and watched him waddle heron-legged away. Then she saw him whip his head to look across the water at the same time she herself heard the sound. The gallop of horse hooves as two cavalry riders rode into the marsh, one in blue and the other gray, though between sweat and dust you could hardly tell them apart. One had his saber out and whipped his horse with it, fleeing the other, who aimed a long-barreled pistol and fired, but missed. Buford and the women watched the contest unfold, their various errands arrested. As the riders neared the water, the pursuer fired again, and the swordsman fell from his horse without a sound. He scrambled up to run, hands and knees, like an ape, as the pistolier fired again, but nothing happened. Even at that distance, they could see him check his weapon, but it was empty. He threw it at the scrambling man, then he drew his own saber and jumped from his horse. The wounded man scuttled to his feet, and they met standing, their swords flashing in the sunlight. Over the water, the thrusts were silent, but the parries sounded almost like whip cracks. One nearly slashed the other, but lost his balance. Then they both rushed in close and grappled with their spare hands on each other's hilts until they fell sidelong into the water. They came up waist deep and sputtering, but slashed at the water as they wiped their faces and continued their duel. Buford was wading sideways back toward the women, his eyes keen on the fight. They glanced at him, but kept their focus on the cavalrymen. The sword fight drifted closer as one tried again to flee the other, and by the time they'd reached the middle of the pond, they had to raise their arms almost over their heads just to strike. Buford had reached the women and was standing beside them at the plank. The soldiers were sputtering and half choking in the marsh now, and both had seen the spectators on the shore, and both began to call for help. They swung again, each flailing and splashing, until with a blind, wild swipe, one gashed the other across the face. Even from the shore and amid the thrashing in the water, the spectators heard the crack of his cheekbone, and a spray of blood arced out from his severed nose. He collapsed on his back to float away in the marsh. The victor, panting and spitting out water, dog-paddled to the bank, crying for help as he too was wounded, was in fact the man who'd been shot. As he approached, Buford held out his hand and the cavalryman grabbed it, but Buford, holding tight to the man's free arm, jabbed a sharp punch and broke his nose. Then he gripped the officer's collar and forced him underwater. The shallow water roiled with their struggle as Buford plunged him like laundry and sometimes loosed his grip on the collar to punch the man in the face, cursing and spitting the while, his teeth showing to the gums. The girl said, "God Almighty," loud enough for Buford to hear, and when he looked their direction, he shouted for the women to go after the man floating away. They dropped their wash and the string of fish and jumped feet first into the water as though they'd been awaiting permission. When they reached the other man and took hold of him, he writhed and spat blood in the air like a circus dolphin, and they exclaimed together, "Hell, he's still alive!" They both dunked him under, a shoulder apiece, and drowned him as well. When he'd gone limp in the water, they hauled the corpse to the shore, where Buford already was stripping his dead soldier and tossing the clothes to the bank. He was hissing in the form of words, "Goddamn son of a bitch," over and over with each exhaled breath. When the women reached him, he pointed across the water to the horses and their saddlebags. "To hell with them fish, we'll all eat good now. Look at all that gear on them horses, and hell, the horses themselves." The girl nodded and said, not with joy, but as if to inventory what they'd yet to see, "I bet there's a mess kit and blankets and ammunition and who knows what else in them saddlebags." The horses stood calm by the water, one with his head dipped to drink. The old woman made no comment, bent as she was to her work. Buford seethed still and had torn 2 buttons from the trousers. The girl touched his arm and he looked at her hand there. He refused to look at her, but he moved with greater deliberation, and the trousers came loose from the dead man's hips. They worked side by side and finished the bodies and piled the clothes, then kicked the men back in the water to float away. I was trying to remember before we got up here where I had read Zoe Miller's work before, and it was Front Porch. That's where I first read some of your work. But later I found out she was in this Fields, and this thing is getting fantastic buzz among the writing community. A lot of people are talking about it. So it's a big deal. If you can grab a copy of that tonight, please do. And thank you.
Thanks very much, Zoe. Thanks, Sam. It was a wonderful evening. Y'all can mingle a while, buy books, have a good time. Thanks.